In the spring of 1974, in Hettinger County, North Dakota, a 31-year-old woman named Lorraine Buell let the grass grow tall along the fence lines of her family's 640-acre ranch, and the whole county thought she had lost her mind. It started at the Hettinger Co-op, the way most things started in Hettinger County. A man named Daryl Schott came in for mineral blocks and mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd driven past the Buell place on Highway 12 and noticed the fence lines looked like nobody had touched them in 2 years. The grass was knee-high in the draws. The brush was coming back along the north pasture edge. The thistle was visible from the road. Daryl said it looked like the place was going to seed. The man behind the counter said he'd heard Lorraine was trying something. Someone else said that wasn't trying something. That was giving up. By the time the story reached the diner on Main Street in Hettinger, it had grown into a full accounting of neglect. The weeds were chest high, the cattle were thin, the fences were failing, and Lorraine Buell was either grieving too hard to manage the place or had simply decided ranching was beyond her. By the time it reached the church parking lot on Sunday, the story had a conclusion attached to it. She'd be selling by fall. She was not selling by fall. She was not grieving too hard to manage the place, and the weeds were not weeds. Let me tell you about Lorraine Buell. Because what she did with that grass only makes sense if you understand who she was and who taught her to see land the way she saw it. Lorraine was born in 1943 on the same 640 acres she was ranching in 1974, the second of 4 children and the only one who stayed. Her father was a man named Clem Buell, and Clem was not a complicated man in most respects, but he was a complicated farmer. He had come to Hettinger County from eastern South Dakota in 1931 during the worst of it, and he had watched his own father lose a homestead to a combination of drought, debt, and bare ground. Clem arrived in North Dakota with the specific education that comes from watching a farm blow away, and he spent the next 40 years applying that education to every decision he made on his own land. Clem ran a cow-calf operation on the 640 acres mixed grass prairie that ran from the highway south into a series of draws and coulees that drained toward the Grand River. He kept between 80 and 120 head depending on the year, never more than the grass could carry without showing strain, and he was religious about that number in a way that made his neighbors uncomfortable. When the rains were good and the grass was thick, his neighbors stocked heavy. Clem did not. When the rains failed and the grass burned back, his neighbors destocked at a loss. Clem sold a few cows at the top of his predetermined number and watched the grass recover. He never bought hay he didn't grow himself. He never borrowed money to expand the herd. He kept a ledger in a green canvas cover that tracked every pound of gain, every dollar of input, every inch of rainfall going back to 1937. And he consulted that ledger the way other men consulted almanacs, except the ledger was specific to his land and his grass and his cattle, and it was always right. Clem's workshop was a poured concrete building 30 feet by 40 feet behind the main house, with a tin roof that drummed in the rain and a wood stove in the corner that he fired up in October and kept going until April. The workbench ran the full length of the south wall made from 2-in oak planks he'd milled himself in 1948, from a stand of timber he'd cleared from the east draw. His tools hung on the wall above the bench on pegboard he'd mounted himself. Each tool's outline traced in paint so he could see at a glance what was missing. He had a set of soil probes he'd bought from a conservation district in 1958 that he used to pull cores from his pastures every spring, laying them out on the workbench and reading them the way a doctor reads an x-ray. He had a hand-drawn map of his 640 acres on the wall above the probes annotated in pencil with grass species, water sources, fence lines, and notes going back 20 years. When Lorraine was 8 years old, Clem started bringing her into the workshop when he pulled the soil cores. He showed her what healthy root depth looked like. He showed her the difference between blue grama and western wheatgrass and buffalo grass and what each one told him about the condition of the soil underneath. He told her that the grass was not the product of the ranch. The grass was the ranch, was everything else. The cattle, the fences, the equipment was just a way of converting the grass into something you could sell. Lorraine's brothers left. The oldest went to Bismarck for work in 1961. The second went to the Army and came back to Bismarck. The youngest left for college in 1965 and did not come back. Lorraine had been accepted to the University of North Dakota in 1961, had a suitcase packed, had a bus ticket from Hettinger. She did not get on the bus. She has never said precisely why, and the narrator will not invent reasons for her. What is documented is that she was still on the ranch in 1962 and in 1963 and in every year after that, working alongside Clem as his health declined through the late 1960s. Clem died in February of 1972, leaving Lorraine the 640 acres free and clear. The herd of 94 cows and 2 bulls the equipment, the workshop the ledger going back to 1937, and a savings account at the First National Bank of Hettinger with $34.00 in it. She was 29 years old. She owned everything outright. She owed nothing. She kept the ledger going in the same green canvas cover, using the same columns Clem had used, adding her own notation system for something Clem had taught her but never fully formalized: the condition of the grass at the fence lines. Now, the fence lines. When Lorraine looked at the tall grass and thick brush growing along the perimeter fences and the cross fences of her 640 acres in the spring of 1974, she did not see neglect. She did not see weeds. She saw a library. Here is what Lorraine Buell knew that Hettinger County did not. She had been reading the scientific literature on range management since 1968, when a soil conservationist named Harold Mack had come through the county doing grazing assessments and left a stack of publications from the USDA Soil Conservation Service on Clem's kitchen table. Clem had read them and set them aside. Lorraine had read them and kept reading. She had written to the Extension Service at North Dakota State University in Fargo and received more publications. She had driven to Dickinson twice to attend range management workshops. She had read everything she could find about a concept that was just beginning to enter the range management literature in the early 1970s, the relationship between ungrazed margins, plant diversity, and soil biological activity. The core of what she understood was this: a pasture that is grazed uniformly to a short stubble height across its entire surface, including the fence lines and corners and draws where cattle naturally congregate, loses plant diversity over time. The aggressive, shallow-rooted species that tolerate heavy grazing pressure come to dominate. The deep-rooted perennial grasses that build organic matter and hold moisture through drought retreat and eventually disappear. The soil underneath compacts. The water infiltration rate drops. The pasture produces less forage per acre, not because the rainfall changed, but because the biology of the soil changed. And once that biology changes, it takes years, sometimes decades, to recover. The fence lines were different. Cattle could not graze inside the fence lines. The grass along the fence lines had been growing undisturbed since the fences were built. And what Lorraine found when she began systematically sampling the soil along her fence lines in the spring of 1973 using Clem's soil probes and Clem's methodology was that the soil under the fence line grass was biologically different from the soil in the middle of the same pastures. The organic matter content was higher. The root depth was greater. The earthworm density was measurably different. The water infiltration rate, measured by a simple ring test she'd learned from the NDSU publications, was nearly twice as fast. She had spent the winter of 1973 to 1974 designing a grazing system built around that observation. She divided her 640 acres into 8 paddocks using temporary electric fence, a technology that was still uncommon in Hettinger County in 1974, and she began rotating her cattle through those paddocks on a schedule designed to mimic, in a rough way, the movement of the bison herds that had grazed the same grass before the homesteaders arrived. The cattle would graze a paddock hard for a short period, then move. The paddock would rest. The grass would recover fully before the cattle returned. And the fence lines, the permanent perimeter and cross fences, she left ungrazed entirely. Not because she couldn't manage them, because she was using them as her control group. She was watching what the grass could do when nothing touched it, and she was using that observation to set her targets for what the grazed pastures could become. That was what Daryl Schott saw from Highway 12 in the spring of 1974. He saw the fence lines. He did not see the paddock rotation. He did not see the soil probes. He did not see the ledger now filling a second green canvas cover with columns tracking forage mass estimates, days of grazing, recovery periods, and rainfall. He saw tall grass along the fence and drew the conclusion that tall grass along a fence means nobody's managing the place. That's why nobody understood what Lorraine was doing. They were seeing neglect. They were watching a 40-year experiment begin. Let me tell you about the build, because this is where Lorraine proved that seeing clearly is the rarest and most expensive form of intelligence and the cheapest to act on if you already own the land. The electric fence system was the primary capital expenditure. Lorraine bought a Gallagher Energizer from a farm supply in Dickinson in the fall of 1973, a unit that would power 12 miles of single-strand wire for $210. She bought 12 miles of 5-gauge high-tensile wire at 4 cents per foot, totaling $253. She bought 400 fiberglass step-in posts at 35 cents each, totaling $140. She bought insulators, connectors, and grounding rods for $38. She drove the posts herself over the course of 3 weekends in October and November of 1973, using a post pounder she'd borrowed from a neighbor, and returned before he'd noticed it was gone. Total infrastructure cost for the rotational system, $641. She moved the cattle through the first full rotation in the spring and summer of 1974. The paddocks were sized so that each one received approximately 28 days of respite between grazings at her stocking rate of 94 cows. She tracked forage height before and after each grazing event with a homemade wire frame she'd built in Clem's workshop from half-inch rebar, a simple device that let her measure grass height consistently across the paddock. She recorded every measurement in the ledger. By the end of the first full grazing season, the numbers were telling her something. The cattle were gaining weight at a rate she had not seen on the ranch before, not because she was feeding them more, because the grass they were grazing was more nutritious, rested grass, grass that had been allowed to grow to its full vegetative stage before being grazed, has a higher crude protein content and a higher digestibility than grass that is continuously grazed at a short stubble height. Lorraine knew this from the literature. Now she was seeing it in her weigh records. The calves she weaned in the fall of 1974 averaged 487 pounds. The calves she had weaned in the fall of 1971, the last full year under Clem's management, had averaged 441 pounds. That was 46 pounds per calf. At the fall calf price of 42 cents per pound, that was $19, $32 per calf. Across 87 calves, that was $1,681 in additional revenue in the first year of the rotation system against an infrastructure investment of $641. She paid for the system in one season. She did not tell anyone. She updated the ledger and started planning year 2. If you have ever watched a community dismiss someone's work before they could see the results, stick with me. Because what happened over the next 8 years in Hettinger County is the part of the story that the ledger was built for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 8 years, because this is where the story stops being about grass management and starts being about something else entirely. Lorraine ran the rotational system through 1975, 1976, and 1977 without changing the fundamental design. She adjusted paddock sizes as she accumulated data. She extended rest periods during dry years. She shortened them during wet years. She added a second water source in the east paddocks in 1976 using a gravity-fed tank. She plumbed herself from a spring in the east draw at a cost of $180 in pipe and fittings and 2 weekends of digging. She tracked every input in the ledger. She tracked every output. She tracked rainfall from the gauge Clem had mounted on the workshop in 1938. She tracked soil temperature using a probe she bought from a garden supply catalog. She tracked the species composition of her pastures by walking transects twice a year and recording what she found. The species composition data was the most remarkable column in the ledger. In 1974, her pastures were dominated by Kentucky bluegrass, an introduced species that had come in with the homesteaders and tolerated continuous heavy grazing better than the native grasses. By 1977, she was recording significant increases in western wheatgrass, green needlegrass, and Sidioates grama, all native deep-rooted perennials that had been suppressed under the old continuous grazing system. By 1979, she was finding blue grama and buffalo grass in the south paddocks, species that Clem's soil cores from the 1940s had recorded as present and that had not been visible in the pastures since at least the early 1960s. The fence lines were doing exactly what she had predicted. The soil biology under the fence line grass was spreading laterally into the adjacent pasture soil, as the rest periods gave the pasture roots time to grow deep and build organic matter. The fence lines were not the point. They were the proof. They were the visible edge of what the entire pasture was slowly becoming. Her calf weights continued to climb. 501 pounds average. 1976, 498 pounds a dry year, but still 57 pounds above the 1971 baseline. 1977, 519 pounds. 1978, 528 pounds. She was not adding feed. She was not adding irrigation. She was not adding synthetic fertilizer. She was adding rest. Her costs were not going up. They were going down. The improved soil infiltration rate meant her pastures recovered faster after rain and held moisture longer during dry spells. She was buying less hay. In 1971, Clem had bought 40 tons of hay to supplement the herd through a dry August. In 1978, Lorraine bought 12 tons. The difference was $840 at the going hay price of $30 per ton. That $840 went into the savings account at First National. The story at the diner had changed by 1977. Not to admiration, to puzzlement. The cattle looked good. People could see that from the road, but the fence line still looked wild. And the paddock rotation, the temporary electric fence that went up and came down on a schedule nobody else was running, still looked like an experiment that hadn't quite settled into a real ranching operation. The consensus at the co-op was that she was getting lucky with the weather. Hettinger County had seen decent rainfall from 1975 through 1978, and decent rainfall covers a lot of management mistakes. When the dry years came back, they said she'd find out what a real stocking program looked like. A man named Gene Vickers, who ran 200 head on a section and a half east of Hettinger and was considered by most of the county to be its best cattleman, drove past the Buell place in the summer of 1978 and stopped his truck at the gate. He had not been invited. He stood at the fence for a long time looking at the cattle in the near paddock. Then he looked at the fence line grass. Then he looked at the cattle again. He drove home and did not say anything at the co-op for 3 days, which was unusual enough that people noticed. The following spring, Gene Vickers called Lorraine Buell and asked if he could walk her pastures with her. She said yes. They spent 4 hours walking the 640 acres. Lorraine showed him the soil cores. She showed him the transect data. She showed him the forage height measurements before and after grazing. She showed him the calf weight records going back to 1974 and the baseline from Clem's records going back further. Gene Vickers was 54 years old and had been ranching Hettinger County his entire adult life. He took his cap off and rubbed the back of his neck and looked at the ledger for a long time without saying anything. He said, "How long before I'd see results like this?" She said, 3 years minimum, probably 5 before the soil changes show up in the forage. He said, "Clem would have understood this." She said, "He taught me most of it." Gene Vickers went home and ordered a Gallagher Energizer and 12 miles of high-tensile wire. He did not tell anyone at the co-op why. The word spread differently after that. Not from the feed store to the diner to the church parking, the way gossip travels. It spread from Gene Vickers to 2 ranchers he trusted, and from those 2 ranchers to 3 others. And it traveled the way information travels when farmers are telling other farmers something they have seen with their own eyes in a ledger, with numbers attached. It was slower gossip and it carried more weight. Lorraine did not celebrate. She updated the ledger and started planning the following year's rotation. Let me tell you about what happened in the early 1980s, because this is where the story stops being about Hettinger County and starts being about every farming county in the northern plains. And because the ending is the part that Clem Beal would have understood without a word of explanation. You know what happened in the early 1980s? The interest rates climbed to 18 and 19%. The land values that had been rising through the late 1970s collapsed. The cattle prices fell. The input costs, fuel, fertilizer, equipment did not fall with them. The farmers and ranchers who had borrowed against rising land values to expand their operations, who had financed new equipment and additional acres, and larger herds on the assumption that prices would stay high and rates would stay manageable found themselves with a debt service that could not be covered by what the market was paying for cattle. The banks began calling notes. The auctions began. In Hettinger County between 1981 and 1985, 11 ranching operations that had been running for more than 20 years sold or were foreclosed. Not because those ranchers were bad at their work, because they had built their operations on borrowed money, during a period when borrowed money seemed cheap, and when the cost of that money tripled, the operations could not carry the weight. The land went to auction. Some of it went to larger operators who had the cash reserves to buy at distressed prices. Some of it went to speculators from Bismarck and Minneapolis who had no intention of ranching it. Lorraine Buell's expenses did not change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. She had no debt service because she had no debt. Her equipment was paid for. Her land was paid for. Her herd had been built from retained heifers, not purchased cattle financed on credit. Her hay costs had been declining for 6 years because her pastures were producing more forage per acre every year. She watched the auctions the way Clem had described watching the drought of the 1930s, not with satisfaction because there was nothing satisfying about watching a neighbor lose a place his family had built, but with a quiet, steady recognition that the thing she had been building was the only kind of operation that could survive what was happening. By 1983, Lorraine had $91,000 in the savings account at First National. In the fall of 1983, 320-acre parcel adjoining her south fence line went to auction. It had been the Schott place, Daryl Schott operation, the same man who had started the story at the co-op in 1974. Daryl had borrowed against his land in 1978 to buy a new tractor and expand his cow herd to 180 head. When the rates climbed and the cattle prices fell, the debt service on the expansion consumed everything the operation produced, and then some. The bank had been patient for 2 years. In the fall of 1983, the patience ended. The auction was held on a Tuesday in October. There were bidders from Bismarck. There was a land investment company from Minneapolis, represented by a man in a coat that was wrong for the weather. The opening bid was $180 per acre, which was below what the land had been worth 5 years earlier, and above what most of the county thought it would bring given the market. The bidding moved slowly. The Minneapolis man dropped out at $210 per acre. The Bismarck bidders stayed in until $225. Lorraine Buell bid $230 per acre. There was a pause in the bidding that lasted long enough to become a different kind of silence. The Bismarck bidders looked at each other. One of them made a counter at $235. Lorraine bid $240. The Bismarck bidders consulted for a moment and did not counter. 320 acres at $240 per acre, $76,800. She wrote the check from the First National account before she left the auction barn. The crowd did not applaud. They did not congratulate her loudly or make a scene of it. What happened was quieter than that and more permanent. People looked at each other and then looked at Lorraine Buell, a 40-year-old woman in a ranch coat who had just written a check for $76,800 in cash for land that shared a fence line with her own, and they rearranged something in their understanding of what they had been watching for the past 9 years. The man from the Minneapolis Investment Company put his papers in his briefcase and left without speaking to anyone. Gene Vickers, who had been standing near the back of the barn, put his cap back on his head and walked out into the October afternoon and did not say anything to anyone, which was by then his way of saying everything. Daryl Schott was not at the auction. He had signed the papers at the bank the week before and had not come back to watch the place sell. Lorraine drove past his house on the way home. She did not stop. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already said. She was home before dark. She updated the ledger. 320 acres added, south boundary, October 1983, $240 per acre paid. She began planning the following spring's rotation across 960 acres. Let me tell you how this ends because the ending is the part that Clem would have recognized as the whole point. Lorraine farmed the expanded 960 acres for another 18 years. She added the Schott land to her rotational system in the spring of 1984, dividing it into 4 additional paddocks and letting the first full rotation run for 2 years before she stocked it at full capacity. The shock land had been continuously grazed for decades, and the soil biology was depleted. She knew it would take time. She was patient. By 1988, the forage production on the former shock land had increased enough that she was able to add 40 cows to her herd without buying supplemental hay. The fence lines on the shock land, which had been mowed clean every year under Daryl's management, began to show native grass recovery within 3 years of the rotation beginning. In 1988, the drought came. It was the worst drought in the northern plains since the 1930s, and it tested every ranching operation in Hettinger County in the same way the debt crisis of the early 1980s had tested them. Except this time, the instrument was weather, not finance. Ranchers who had rebuilt their herds after the debt crisis found themselves without forage. Hay prices tripled. Some operations that had survived 1981 through 1985 did not survive 1988. Lorraine's pastures, with their improved soil infiltration rates and their recovering native grass diversity and their deep-rooted perennial species that had been building root mass for 14 years of rotational rest, produced more forage per acre in the drought year of 1988 than her neighbors' continuous grazed pastures produced in a normal year. She bought hay. She reduced her stocking rate by 20% as a precaution. She did not liquidate her herd. When the drought broke in 1989, she restocked from her own retained heifers. Her niece, a girl named Sandra, who is Lorraine's brother's youngest daughter, came to the ranch in the summer of 1991 at the age of 15 and spent the summer learning the rotation system. Lorraine put her to work with the soil probes first, the same way Clem had put Lorraine to work with them at the age of 8. Sandra pulled cores from every paddock and laid them out on the workbench in Clem's workshop and learned to read them. She learned to walk transects and record species. She learned to estimate forage mass by eye and confirm it with the wireframe. She learned the ledger. By the end of that summer, she could read Clem's columns from 1937 and understand what he had been measuring and why. Lorraine handed the operation to Sandra in 2001 when Lorraine was 58 years old. The ranch was 960 acres, all of it paid for, carrying 162 cows and 4 bulls with a savings account at First National that had rebuilt itself to $118,000 after the land purchase and the drought year and 18 years of continued operation. The ledger had filled 4 green canvas covers by then. Sandra started a 5th. Clem's workshop was still standing. The pegboard was still on the south wall. The soil probes were still in their bracket above the workbench. The A map of the original 640 acres was still pinned above the probes, its pencil annotations, now supplemented by Sandra's additions in a different hand, tracking the shock paddocks and the new water sources and the species recovery data from the 1990s. The wood stove still worked. The oak workbench had not moved. In the spring of 2003, the North Dakota Grazing Lands Coalition held its annual meeting in Hettinger, and Lorraine Buell was asked to speak. She was 60 years old. She stood at the front of the room in the same ranch coat she'd worn to the auction in 1983 and said what she had been demonstrating for 29 years in plain language, without notes. She said, "A fence line is not a problem to be mowed. It is a record of what your soil can do when nothing disturbs it. If your fence line grass is taller and thicker and more diverse than your pasture grass, your fence line is not overgrown. Your pasture is understocked with biology. The fence line is telling you where you need to go, not where you failed to mow." She said, "The people who laughed at my fence lines were looking at the wrong thing. They were measuring management by tidiness. I was measuring management by what the cattle weighed in October." She said, "My father kept a ledger because the ledger told the truth about the land. I kept the same ledger because the truth didn't change when he died. It won't change when I'm gone. Sandra will keep it because the grass doesn't care who's holding the pencil. It only cares whether you're paying attention." Gene Vickers was in the room. He was 78 years old by then and had been running a modified rotational system on his own land since 1980. He did not say anything during the question period. After the meeting, he found Lorraine in the parking lot and shook her hand and said, "Clem raised you right," she said. "He showed me what to look at. The rest was just looking. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at a fence line with tall grass growing thick along the wire?" Most people see neglect. They see a management failure, evidence that someone isn't keeping up with the work, that the place is going to seed, that the woman running it doesn't know what she's doing. Lorraine Buell saw a soil core. She saw a water infiltration rate. She saw 46 extra pounds on a calf in October. She saw $1,681 in the first year and $91,000 in the 9th and 320 acres in the 10th. She saw what happens when you let the biology do the work instead of fighting it with a mower and a borrowed credit line. The whole county saw weeds. She saw the ranch, $641 in electric fence wire and step-in posts, a set of soil probes her father bought from a conservation district in 1958, a green canvas ledger that told the truth about the land for 60 years across 3 hands. The fence lines nobody wanted to look at, growing tall and wild and deep-rooted along the wire of the woman. Nobody understood until the cattle told them everything they needed to know.